Moisture meters. Does this tool work, and should you use it? I'm going to answer those two questions using two different videos. In this video, I'm going to ask the question, does the moisture meter work? In my next video, I'm going to answer a slightly different question. What are the pros and cons of moisture meters, and should you be using them? Before I can discuss the pros and cons, I need to know whether these things actually work. So I went on the internet and looked for a set of tests that I could apply to one of these to test it. How good is it? And how accurate is it? I couldn't find a test anywhere. Lots of videos show you how to use these things, but nobody shows you how to actually test it to see if it's working. So I developed my own 6-part test to see if this works. And that's what I'm going to tell you about in this video. For this test, I'm going to use my Rapid Mini pH and moisture meter. So this meter has a switch here to switch between pH and moisture, and it has 2 probes, one for pH and one for moisture. Now the tests I'm going to do are valid for any one of these cheaper type of moisture meters that are designed for gardeners. They're somewhere in the order of $10 to $15 on Amazon. You can buy them with different manufacturer names on them, but you can tell by looking at them that they were all manufactured in the same place. They all use a dial from 1 to 10, 1 being very dry, 10 being very wet, and you have a little needle that goes back and forth. For soil, what I'm going to use is pots about this size, and I'm going to put Pro Mix in here, which is my standard mix. And I have some of these pots that are very dry, I have some that are very wet, some in between depending on what the test is. The first test I want to do is repeatability. If I take this meter and put it in a pot, take it out, clean it off, put it back in again, do I get the same reading? That's repeatability. Will I get the same reading every time I measure this pot? To run this test, I prepared 2 pots. One that was very dry and another one that was very wet. And then I took the meter, I marked the probes, so I inserted at the same depth every time. I took the probe, inserted it in the soil at the right depth, waited a few seconds for the needle to settle down, and took a reading. Then I took it out, cleaned off the probes, inserted it again at the same depth, took another reading. And I repeated that over and over again. What I found was that the repeatability of this meter was pretty good. Every time I put it in the soil, I got the same reading. Now that's not accuracy, that's repeatability. So if this meter gives me the same reading every time, it could be a good reading or it could be a terrible reading. It just means it's consistent. Every time I put it in the same soil in the same spot, I will get the same reading. My next test is to measure the extreme limits. I took a pot, filled it with soil, and let it sit for 4 weeks. I wanted to have the soil extremely dry, and I expect the meter to give me a 1. No moisture in here at all. I took a second pot, watered it really well. Then I let it sit overnight in water, so the water was soaking up from the bottom. The next day I drained that pot and took some measurement. Now that's as wet as I can make this soil, and I expect a value of 10. When I took my actual readings, what I found was that the very dry pot gave me a 2.5. No matter how dry this soil gets, I will never get down to 1. The lowest is 2.5. In my wet pot, I only got as high as a 9, never got a 10. So although the meter shows you a range of 1 to 10, it's actually only a range from 2.5 to 9, at least in my case. Which means that that range is 6.5 units, so it's not nearly as accurate as you think it is. 10 units is more accurate than 6.5. The other problem you would have is that some of the plants should be watered when they get quite dry, like a 2. Well, with this meter, I will never get a 2. So if I was using this meter for that kind of plant, it would never get watered. Test number 3 is a compaction test. How do the readings change based on how hard the soil is compacted in here? So to run this test, I took a pot, put in some Pro Mix, and left it very loose. Now Pro Mix is a peat-based soil, and it's quite fluffy when you start out with it. So I took a reading with the fluffy material. Then I packed it down. And I normally do that when I'm planting. And the reason for that is that if I don't do that, it will compact anyways as I water. And a couple weeks later, the plant is sitting too high and the soil has shrunk down. So when I plant, I always compact it. So now I have the same soil, the exact same moisture, but it's more compacted, and I took a second reading. So the first reading was with loose soil, the second reading with compacted soil. The loose soil gave me a reading of 4. The compacted soil gave me a reading of 5.5. Now, why is that? Remember that this meter does not actually measure moisture. It measures conductance. How well does the current travel in the probe? A soil that's loose has more air and a relatively smaller amount of moisture, and so it gives a lower reading. There's less conductivity, which shows up on the meter as a drier reading. When you compact it, you push out the air, so the relative amount of moisture increases. Now, the total amount of moisture hasn't changed, but the relative amount is. With less air, the water's molecules are closer together in there because it's compacted, and it gives a wetter reading. And the difference is 1.5 units, which is significant. Makes a difference of either watering today or not watering today. So what this tells me is that you'll get different readings depending on how old the plant is in this pot. When it's newly planted, you'll get drier readings. As the soil compresses and the plant is in here for a while, and it gives a wetter reading for the same amount of moisture. When you do take a measurement, you have to make sure that the bottom part of the probe and at least some of the upper part is in contact with the soil. So you have to insert it at least this much. And I would recommend that you always go in at least 2 inches. Anything shallower than that may give you false readings because you don't have good contact with both electrodes. So I put it in the soil at 2 inches deep, took a reading. Then I went deeper, took another reading, went deeper, took another reading, and so on. Now you would think all those readings are the same, but what I actually found was that the readings changed depending on how deep I pushed the meter. Now there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that soil tends to dry from the top, and so the top could be a little drier. The other reason is that newly watered plants tend to hold water in the bottom, so they have a wetter layer down here. If this probe gets into that water layer, you'll get a reading that says it's very wet. So when you're using this meter, it's important to go in at least 2 inches, but stay away from the bottom 2 inches of the pot. And quite honestly, what you need to do is you need to go to the same depth all the time. If you're constantly going to a different depth, the readings don't tell you a lot. The other thing I tried in this experiment was to take readings in the middle of a pot and also near the edge of a pot. Now, these pots had been ones that were watered several days ago, and they've had a chance to partially dry. But what I found is that near the edge, it's always drier than in the middle. So what this tells me is that when I use this meter, I can't just stick it in anywhere. I need to be consistent. Every time I measure this pot, I have to go in the same place. Same distance in from the edge and the same depth. Test number 5. How does fertilizer affect the readings? Now this meter measures conductivity, and to have conductivity you have to have salts in the water. So in theory, water that has no salts, like really clean water with no fertilizer in it, should give me a different reading than water with fertilizer in it. And I wanted to see what the difference was. So I took a pot of fresh soil, watered it with distilled water. Now distilled water has no salts in it. Took a reading. Then I took my normal tap water, which is quite hard, so it has salts in it. And I put my normal amount of fertilizer in, added more salts, and then used that and watered the pot, then took another reading. The difference between those 2 readings, taken at exactly the same spot in the pot, was 1 unit. Now, I'm actually quite surprised at that. I expected a larger difference between these 2 readings. Now, it may be that my ProMix has some fertilizer in the soil. And so even though I used distilled water, it had some salts in there. But based on my measurements, the fertilizer and the salts in your water are not going to make a huge difference in the readings. My last test is a comparison test. The meter against the finger. Which one is more accurate? I've been gardening for many years, and the way I decide if a pot needs watering is one of 2 ways. I use my finger, and I just touch the soil near the top, and I can tell whether it's wet. Or I use the hefting method. Hefting means to lift the pot. And I've been growing these things long enough that I can just lift the pot and I can tell you roughly how much moisture is in here. I can certainly decide whether this plant needs to be watered today. So the challenge is my method against the meter. Do I get the same kind of answers? So I used my plant collection for this, and quite honestly I used mostly my streptocarpus because I had those in various size pots. Some were recently potted, some had big root systems, so I had a lot of variation here. I've also been growing these guys for over a year now, and I know how and when to water them. So the first thing I did was go to the plant list and look up the plant to see what its moisture number is. Well, it's not on the list. So I'm sort of stuck, I guess. But I know streptocarpus are watered very similar to African violets, and African violets were on the list. They are a value 3. So if the reading is 3 or less, you should water. If it's 3 or above, don't water. So I went through my collection, and what I found was that the meter and my watering techniques didn't match very well at all. Sometimes the meter said they're too dry water, and I've lifted them up and I touched the soil and that was fine. It didn't need watering. In other cases, the meter said they were too wet, and I went and lifted them. I thought, well, geez, these need watering. Maybe not today, but certainly tomorrow. I then went through my other plants and did the same thing and pretty much found the same kind of results. The meter and my method in a lot of cases didn't match. I also grow a lot of orchids, and they have coconut chunks and lots of air in between. And the meter is pretty much useless for orchids because there's too much air in there. The meter is only good when most of it is soil and the particles are much smaller. There you have it. Those are my 6 tests for measuring the moisture meter. Now I've done these tests in pots because it's a little easier working inside and besides the middle of winter here. But you can do the tests outside just as well as inside. Just do them in the garden and use your garden soil. And if you have one of these devices, I suggest you go through those tests and try for yourself. It will give you a lot of insights about how the meter works and what its limitations are. Now in my next video, I'm going to go through the pros and cons of moisture meters and then give you my evaluation and my suggestion of whether or not you should use this device. And when that video is finished, which will take me a couple days, I'll put a link to it in the top right-hand corner. If you want to get notified when that video is ready, make sure you subscribe and hit the little bell so you get notified. Happy gardening!